And so we only go to use the formal rite when all other means of liberating this person have not met the mark. We haven't been able to liberate them fully. And it's only after the judgment on my part and consultation with my bishop, so that I have to have a certain amount of real certitude to believe that the formal exorcism is the way to go. Now, with regards to oppression, some of the ways in which that happens, 80% of the people who come to me are sexually abusive. 80%. That's a soul. John Paul II made reference to this back with the sexual abuse scandal among clergy in 2002. But it's a soul. Demons are always looking for people who have broken relationships or no relationships. So very, very often, if people have been abused, it's usually as a prepubescent, until around the age of around 8 or 9. And then they themselves go and they kind of dabble, just simply out of curiosity, with a Ouija board at a birthday party. And it's not the person who plays the Ouija board once, it's the person who gets good at the Ouija board. Or they, go and they think it's cute to go and have their palms read, or go to a fortune teller. It's like putting a bullseye on your back because of the abuse. So those are probably the preponderance of sexual abuse and its relationship with the occult is probably one of the most common ways it happens, where there's oppression and obsession.
Over to your left here, Father.
Yes.
Good evening, Father. Thank you for your talk.
Sure.
In one of the parishes I've been in, doing things in the church, one time I had the occasion of rearranging statues from one position to maybe an original pedestal that's sort of beyond the eyesight of standing up high. And when I was getting it cleared to put the statue up there, I found on 2 of those high pedestals a cluster of crystals. And I don't know much about it, but is it always associated with someone trying to apply a curse or to just sacrilege, profane? What is going on? And it shows to the extent that people, because our churches are left open, we try to leave them open for people, but these type of elements come in too. But what could be involved with what their motivation?
Well, I think the motivation, did everybody get the question? It's Father found crystals behind 2 statues that he moved. It could be both. It could be sacrilege in terms of simply a form of mockery against the church. It's not impossible that the person who may have done this may have been attempting to maybe put a curse on the building itself. In our diocese, just about 6 weeks ago, I went down to exercise the Newman Center in San Jose State because somebody had put a dead cat at the front door. And the Newman Center coordinator cleaned up the dead cat. And a few days later, she and 2 students were in the living room of the Newman Center in San Jose State, and a glass went flying off the table in front of the 3 of them. So she called me and then told me the story, and I went down. It's, did some person deliberately put a dead cat there in order to somehow put some kind of a hex on the Newman Center? I wouldn't rule it out.
Do you think there should be an intentional prayer of blessing that I should do to counter that gesture?
Yes. I would use the Leo the 13th prayer. And any priest can pray it in your local diocese. Pray the Leo the 13th prayer. That's the prayer of exorcism of the place. But I would definitely do it in your church. A couple of times a year, we rededicate our parish church to Christ, just because sometimes people, not physically bring into the church, but sometimes people can bring in stuff that they don't even know they brought in. So, but I would definitely use the Leo the 13th prayer.
We probably have 8 hands up, so we're just going to have to go a little bit more quickly.
We'll get it.
Yeah, we'll get to the other one. So, okay.
Hi, Father me up over, the high vault basically. And slowly drifting away from Christ. But every time God things were happening, I would still run in my Bible and pray. And it was interesting that I got away from it after 7 years. But when I started to go to school, a few people from that cult decided to show up on my bus route that they don't go on. 2 of them drive cars. At first I thought, well, maybe this would be that, and maybe I would do something. But they started saying things to me and asking me how I am, things like that. And, look, I tell everybody how I am. But I started, I fell on the ground for no reason, wearing tennis shoes. It just was weird. I thought, okay, let me just pray about it. And then I'm wondering though, this one particular man, he was angry and just pushed me and said hi, and I said, you're not really allowed to touch me like that. Well, look, I'm not in your cult anymore. I know what it is. I love Jesus Christ, so please leave me alone. Go in peace. But, if they're still thinking about me, and I get emails that would block me everywhere, on Facebook every time, but I'm spiritually getting problems to where this morning, all day, I felt suicidal for no reason, and I don't do that. So I'm wondering, what should I do?
Okay, maybe I can give you the phone number of the exorcist. I don't think you necessarily have a demonic condition per se, but in that cult that you described, were there secrets in that cult? Was that cult involved in any kinds of sacrifices involving Satan? Okay. Were you initiated into that? Were there rituals in which you became a member of that group? Come talk to me after.
Brother, can you explain this, please? I have a nephew. He's 48 years old now. But when he was 4 years old, my mom took care of him, so he stayed with us. At age 4, father, broad daylight, the boy shouted, shaking, very scared, and said, Mom, he calls my mom, Mom, somebody is on top of the piano. And he's pointing, and we couldn't see anybody, anything. It happened twice. So, can you explain, Father?
Was there any particular circumstance? Who is this person that you're...
My nephew.
Your nephew?
Yeah, 4 years old.
Okay. He was 4 years old, and now he's 48. And on 2 instances, he saw entities?
Yes.
Okay. How old was he when he saw the entity the first time?
4 and 5.
Okay, so he saw them when he was very young, and then he just saw that he hasn't seen them since? Okay. Do you have is there family, in your family, do you have people who have these spiritual giftings?
Say it again, Father.
In your family line, are there people who have these giftings to see entities, to see spirits, to read minds?
No. But my parents and my grandparents are very prayerful people.
Okay. Is your nephew still living?
Yes, he's an engineer.
And there's been no more issues since he
No
was...
more.
Okay. It might have been, oftentimes, if there is any gifting, it's much more acute when people are young. Sometimes as people grow older, the gifting can either become very, very slight or it can leave them altogether. I think the fact that he had those 2 instances, but he hasn't had it since, I wouldn't be concerned about it.
We've got a couple more over here.
Speaking to Thank you very much, Father. I was very impressed by what you said. I have a brief question. I live in a very old Victorian house, 1886. My husband, 90s. Correct if I'm twisted here.
You can speak up, so.
So my question is, how effective is house blessings? My husband has one of the creepiest collections of Indian masks that he inherited from his father, as well as pre-Columbian collections that basically give me big willies. And I did have one priest over one time to give a blessing, and he said, he looked at one piece and he said, I'm going to give that a double dose. And so I'm just wondering, how effective is that, and when is it appropriate to have another house blessing if you feel uncomfortable?
Yes, I think it would be appropriate to have an additional house blessing. I know that we have Native American, indigenous spirituality. They invoke spirits too. They did not, they were not Christianized until the Franciscans and other missionaries came. So even in Native American spirituality today, they oftentimes will invoke the spirits of earth and wind and fire. I've had to deal sometimes with the spirits of wind and fire and earth, and there's demons attached to them. So I guess if I were you, I would have an additional house blessing. I would also see if you could ask your husband if he could maybe put his collection somewhere else, outside of the house. But I would definitely have the house blessed again. Is there things that have happened in your home that are outside of the realm of what you consider to be the norm? Then I'd have the house blessed and see what happens. And if you still have them, then I think you need to say to your husband, there's things here that really are potentially dangerous, because there could be spirits attached. Spirits and demons can attach themselves to things. And even though these things are very old and they may look harmless, who knows what they may be used for.
If I could just add, maybe to give a little parenthetical, I do a lot of house blessings myself, and there is the current book of blessings for the blessings of holy water. I tend to use the blessing that incorporates blessed salt. Have you found in your own experience any difference between the two, or is there?
Well, usually I went out to exercise the house today, so I always exercise salt and mix it with exercise water, and then use the exercise water and salt together and go and exercise the house. For a house blessing, like in your case, if I knew what you were going to tell, if you had told me this and I was living in the city, I'd be drinking exercise water and salt, but I would do a house blessing. Sure.
Let's say this. So I have a past, but my question is, if someone is possessed, or they've been possessed, would they still be able to participate fully in the sacraments? Would the demons hide, or would they come out, or how would that work?
It varies. If a person has a demonic condition, very often the person can receive the sacraments and be able to do so peacefully. However, there's lots of times when one of the signs of a demonic condition is an aversion to the sacred. So I've prayed over people who have a very hard time going to receive the Eucharist, and I've prayed over people where there's a demonic condition who are able to relatively with ease receive the sacraments. And why that happens or doesn't happen, I don't always know, except obviously it's a tactic by the demonic to prevent them when the demonic so chooses to do. If there is what we would say is a possession is a relationship. So possession in this kind of conversation is where a demonic system, because there's never one demon, there's a system. There could be thousands or hundreds, but there's always a group, and there's rankings. In the demonic system, one of the key signs is an aversion to the sacred. However, there are times that people are able to come and receive the sacraments. In a full possession, I would think that would be very difficult for a person to be able to do. Because a possession is where the demonic has taken full control of the body, but not the mind. And a demon cannot possess the soul. It can only possess the body because the soul is made in our image and likeness. So in a full possession, where most of the time when people are fully possessed, they're pretty non-functional. It's very difficult for them to receive the sacraments. But if a person has a demonic condition that's lesser than full possession, it varies.
Father, I'm wondering what you think about feng shui, because, you know, in Chinese culture, we practice the feng shui principles of like decluttering and putting crystals in certain positions of the house to bring peace and harmony. So I don't think we think of it as spiritual, but, you know, just for balance and harmony and good luck and good fortune. So is that pretty harmless? I'm hoping it's harmless because that's what we kind of think.
I know nothing about feng shui other than I've heard of it. I am a little familiar with certain other kinds of Chinese practices where people have gotten themselves into trouble, like with Qigong. But when people have been involved with that, they've usually been involved with people who've been involved in other kinds of New Age practices. So I would just, if this has been something that's part of your culture, I think as long as you stay in the state of grace, I would just be cautious. Because the alignment of crystals is in the New Age has a lot to do, and I'm sure this is where people are picking these kinds of things up. They're sort of like you go to a smorgasbord and you pick a little of this, a little of that from this culture and that culture, and then you try and manipulate those kinds of traditions or rituals in a way that's going to provide entry for a spirit. So I think as long as you're cautious about it, but I would be vigilant about your use of those things, personally.
There was, I don't remember how long this was, New York City. You might remember, I don't know if you remember, there was a house that might have been haunted, and there was a devil or devils, there was a picture of it stands with an extremely large black cat, much larger than a human could have done. Do you remember anything like that? It was a number of years ago. I don't know how long ago. Yeah.
No, but there have been houses that I've gone to where there have, if people perform demonic acts in a home, if covens gather, and in the house, the coven invokes Satan.
What about what happened with all those presidents? You know, the thing about presidents, like years ending in zero, died in office, 1840, 1860. You familiar with that?
Well, I have, but I don't understand the point.
Do you think it might have been a result of some Indian curse?
Not the
1840 through 1960, every president during zero,
Yes.
and it almost happened great.
Yes.
You've heard of that.
Yes, I have.
So,
Father, thanks for being here. Question is, there's a book that's out that I understand isn't 100% theologically correct, but it talks a lot about generational entryways for Satan and kind of generational curses and things that may have happened in the womb or prior, or lots of members of a generation being involved in something. I'd like to hear your comments about that, please.
There is validity to generation curses. A curse can happen in the womb. A parent can curse a child up to the age of 7 and dedicate that child to Satan because the child is not yet born free will to the age of 7, to the age of reason. As it applies to generational curses, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Do they exist? Yes. Sometimes people know a lot about their ancestors, even from a few generations back. Sometimes people know nothing about their their generational heritage. People sometimes will get the same kinds of diseases. We look at those sorts of things to see whether or not, you know, it's not always easy to measure whether or not if everybody in 3 or 4 generations have all died from heart disease or cancer, we look at those as being familial diseases. So how do you differentiate on something that's generational from something that's potentially familiar? But if someone says, my grandmother shared with me the curse that was put on the family by her husband's mother or her husband's father or somebody 3 or 4 generations back, then you have to take that with some seriousness. So I'll say, well, can you tell me about what happened? What kind of a curse was it? Was it simply a verbal kind of a curse, which does have some weight? Or was it an animal sacrifice or a blood curse, which is much more powerful, and especially if it's done by a very high powerful witch? So it all depends on the intentionality. Sometimes people can curse another person, which is a really bad thing to do, not necessarily meaning to do what the impact could be, but if people are really intentional and they go see a witch to use some kind of a potion or a spell or killing an animal or even killing a human being, not a human sacrifice, it can have a lot of power. But I don't always know those things. I ask all those questions like a detective, and then some people know enough that can help us. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes if there's a demonic entity attached, they'll have to acknowledge that. Sometimes that's how we find out. I hope that's helpful. But it's a bit fuzzy at times, I have to admit. Yes, please.
A lot of Catholic Christians are practicing yoga. Is that a cult?
No, yoga is not a cult. Yoga is a spiritual practice that very, very often people simply use as a form of exercise. Now, there are gods attached to every single gesture in yoga. Now, some people simply use yoga for a purpose of stretching, and they're not interested in the theology of yoga, if you want to call it that. They're just using it simply for stretching. I personally think if people simply are using yoga as a form of stretching and nothing more, I don't think it's an issue. Now, I'll give you a good example of where the converse happened. I exercised the house today in San Jose, and I went to meet with a Hispanic woman who went to a fair at St. James Park in San Jose recently that was sponsored by the city of San Jose. And at the park, at the fair, sponsored by the city of San Jose, there was a particular organization, whom I will not name, who basically was performing occult rituals in tents. And this woman only went because a friend of hers had encouraged her to go, and to go through a process of yoga which she knew nothing about. And then the person who was helping her with the yoga also was using a triangle and bringing it a certain way from a certain part of the woman's ear. Well, short after that, she got very ill, and she called me. I went down today with a person on my team. So that's very different. People sometimes use yoga for enlightenment or for insight. They get very involved in all of the chants and all of the hums and all of the breathing. I think that is clearly dangerous. And I pray with people who've done that and then who have demonic spirits. Some usually of a low level, but nonetheless, we cast spirits out. So I think if you're simply going down to the local gym and you're just stretching and nothing more, my mother did yoga for years. I think it's probably safe, but I would just be cautious. But I think where people clearly, for them, it's kind of a way of life. It's It's not just a stretch, but it gives me insight, enlightenment, and I'm, all of these ums that go with it and all of the rhythms that go with it, they're opening themselves up big time.
Father Thomas, this is the first time as a Catholic I've been informed, as what you have just said to us, that if a person dies, then his or her soul generally would go directly to God for a particular judgment. But then here you say, which is really news to me, which I'm glad you said this, is that sometimes a person, let's say if he or she committed suicide or if there was a homicide committed, that a soul may actually linger or stay in the house. And so I'm just wondering, why does that happen? And when would the soul ever go to judgment with God? And the second thing I want to throw out, or rather say, I'm sure you might be aware of this radio station that is called Coast to Coast, that originates out of Sherman Oaks, I think, down in California. But there have been many guests who claim to be ghost hunters. So my question is this, where these ghost hunters would have these electronic devices where they would capture EVP, electronic voice phenomena, in insane asylums that were abandoned, in prisons. And when I would hear these little children talk through the recordings, or men talk, or people talking where they're like in pain or something like that. So who are these, where are these voices coming from? Are they coming from maybe those souls that have not gone up for the particular judgment? And by the way, I'm eternally grateful. Well, I didn't mean to say eternally. Well, I mean, I'm very grateful that you're here to talk about the demonic and how we as Catholics can look to God for protection, and thank you very much. And I did read that book about you. I didn't see the movie.
The book is all true. The movie is a movie. Now, if you don't mind, repeat the first part of your question.
Oh, yes. The first part of the question is this. I'm wondering why, well, I'm throwing this little part in too, but I'm wondering why the Catholic Church does not teach that there's a possibility that if a person dies, his or her soul may linger maybe in a house or maybe even in a church or somewhere, and they do not get the particular judgment from God. Why does that take place?
It takes place because God permits it. Because God doesn't interfere in free will, even in judgment, even in death. And so, if a person feels that they're already condemned, then that's been my experience. That's the reason, one of the primary reasons, they don't go for judgment. They're afraid of being judged already. So that's why the tradition of the church has been that when people die, we pray for them. That's why having funeral masses is so important. Because there's an efficaciousness, in other words, there's a power to the grace of the funeral mass. That's why we have, that's the whole cult of daily mass, the tradition of it, comes out of the teaching of the church to pray for those who have died. So that, I mean, when we die, we do believe we either go to heaven, hell, or purgatory. And we're assigned after the conversation with Christ. I would assume